Love the funky music. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning back to the Beta 3 Squad podcast. If you are here, that means that you are interested in learning more about the development of children between birth to 3 years old. Today, we have a topic that occupies every parent and caregiver. It is on our mind day and night. It can make or break our day. I'm referring to the topic of our children's ability to sleep and sleep well. I don't care what anyone says, that is one of the hardest things to adjust to once you become a parent. So if you think about it, your quality of sleep is heavily dependent on your child's ability to sleep and sleep well. But how much of the baby's ability to sleep is dependent on us? So to answer this question and many more, I have Brittany with me today. Hi, Brittany.
Hi.
Brittany is a pediatric sleeping consultant, and you're also a nurse practitioner who specializes in sleep.
Yes.
So excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course, it's my pleasure. And I can't even tell you how many times I've worked with families and talked about development. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I approach the topic of sleeping, you kind of see their whole demeanor just changes.
Oh, yeah.
You see the desperation on their face, the exhaustion. Yep. So thank you for coming in and helping all of our tired caregivers out there.
Yes, I'm very excited to be here and share my knowledge and chat with you.
Great. So should I assume, since you're the sleeping expert, that your children slept the whole night right after birth?
No. Please. So that's actually how I got into all this. So my son, who is almost 7, when we brought him home, I was very naive, and I did not realize that babies didn't just sleep and that sometimes it was a problem. So when we brought him home, he was not sleeping at all. We were not even getting 1 hour stretches. It was horrible. And this was going on for a few months, and my husband and I were beside ourselves because we were exhausted and we could not figure out what was going on. So I talked to my pediatrician about it, and I was like, I'm just going to figure this out. So one night I sent my husband out to the movies by himself, and I sleep trained my son, and it was literally the best thing I ever did, and we never looked back. He was just sleeping the nights. Obviously we had regressions along the way, and I had to figure that out, and I did. But he's been a great sleeper ever since. And then when my daughter came 3 years later, I did something very similar, but I started her even younger. And not really sleep training, but I did a lot of sleep shaping that you would do with newborns, and it just got her on a better track to start with. So yeah.
So we want to definitely clarify all those concepts and terminology.
Sure.
But let's start with what should parents even expect? How much sleep should a baby or a toddler get? What should be a realistic expectation as a parent?
Yeah. So when you bring your baby home from the hospital, you're obviously in that newborn survival phase. So those first 6 weeks, I always say you can't really expect too much, right? You're on their schedule. They don't know their days and nights yet, and that is normal. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to teach them day versus night. So that's what I would say is what you're first trying to do within the first 6 weeks. And most babies are going to be sleeping 18 hours a day at that point. Yeah. So you want to make sure that you're giving them full feeds during the day, every 2 to 3 hours. So that way they know that feeding and being awake is during the day. And then at night, you start to get longer stretches. And then as they get older, I would say some babies I've heard of being able to sleep the night by 8 weeks, but I would say the norm is by 4 months. Most babies can sleep through the night without a feeding, but there are some that still need that one feeding until 7, 8, 9 months. It just depends on the baby, their size, their medical needs, and all that.
So if my baby doesn't sleep a full night and they wake up for feeding pretty often, should I look into sleep training, or I heard you use the term sleep shaping?
Yeah. So sleep shaping is really for newborns. So that's not sleep training, right? They're not going to be crying for long periods of time. It's just kind of giving them those like skills really early on to teach themselves how to self-soothe. But yeah, by that point of like 4 months, if you're still giving your baby like every 2 hours, you're waking up and feeding them to try to get them to sleep, you should really look into what's going on.
Okay. And then sleep training. What does that look like?
Yeah.
What does it require of me as a parent?
Yeah. So sleep training is literally just giving your baby and teaching them independent sleep skills. So it's teaching them to fall asleep on their own and then how to fall back to sleep in the middle of the night on their own, right? So as a parent, if you were going to do this, what I would advise is picking a method that you feel comfortable with. Because if you don't feel comfortable with the method that you're using, you're not going to be consistent, and then it's not going to work. And then everybody just gets frustrated. The parent, the baby, because the baby doesn't know what you're doing, and then you're kind of going back and forth. So that's the first thing I would do. You're also really going to want a solid bedtime routine. I always say how important that is. And then I think the biggest component of it is teaching your baby to put themselves to sleep. So you putting them in their crib fully awake. I think there's a misconception of drowsy but awake, or a lot of parents will rock and feed their babies to sleep. And look, if that works for you, you should do it. But if you get to a point where it's not working anymore, that's kind of an association that I would work on weaning away from.
If I want to sleep train, how do I know what's out there? What's the best method for me?
There's a bunch of them. I mean, you can find them online. You can work with a sleep consultant like myself. What I do in my programs is I give customized sleep plans, right? That have a bedtime routine laid out, and it's custom to fit your family, right? And then I also lay out multiple sleep training options that are appropriate for the age of your baby, right? Because you want to make sure it's an age appropriate method. And then I give you support through that.
I think there is a misconception out there that it's very common to have kids who are poor sleepers, and parents sort of give in because they think, all right, this is temporary and I'm willing to deprive myself of sleep for the sake of my baby. I'll wake up 3 or 4 times at night if that's what they need, because at some point it's going to sort itself out. What do you think about that wait and see approach?
So I think that sometimes the wait and see approach can work, but I also have seen it not. So for an example, I'm working right now with a 7-year-old who's never slept through the night. So by herself, she's always had a parent there laying with her. So I think in that case, if that's something as a parent that you're okay with and it works for your family, then that's fine. But if you're waiting and seeing and then all of a sudden you have a 7-year-old who's not sleeping, or an 8-year-old. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Right. And I think from what I'm gathering from what you say, it really depends on, maybe there is no sleep standard. It's really what the family works well with.
Right, exactly. This isn't like something you have to do, right? But most parents that I see that come to me, they're very distraught and they're exhausted. They're like, they can't function anymore. Especially like a lot of my clients are working moms, right? I'm a working mom. I know you're a working mom, right? And it's like especially with certain jobs, you really need to be on your game. Like when my son was born, I was an ICU nurse. So I really needed to be awake and ready to go. So I get a lot of moms like that who really need to sleep and they want their babies to sleep. So it just depends on what works for your family.
Right. And I think from what I'm gathering from what you say, it really depends on, maybe there is no sleep standard. It's really what the family works well with.
Right, exactly. This isn't like something you have to do, right? But most parents that I see that come to me, they're very distraught and they're exhausted. They're like, they can't function anymore. Especially like a lot of my clients are working moms, right? I'm a working mom. I know you're a working mom, right? And it's like especially with certain jobs, you really need to be on your game. Like when my son was born, I was an ICU nurse. So I really needed to be awake and ready to go. So I get a lot of moms like that who really need to sleep and they want their babies to sleep. So it just depends on what works for your family.
Right. Sometimes I get questions about, parents who really work like weird shifts.
Yeah.
And dad comes home at midnight. So the baby might stay up until that time because the mom, they want to spend time with the baby.
Right.
So the whole sleep schedule is a little shifted because of that family's routine. Yeah. And they ask me, is this okay? And my approach is, as long as it's okay for you, should be okay, right?
I think if it's working, that's fine. But a lot of babies do tend to have an optimal sleep time between 7 and 8. Some babies are more flexible, and if they are and that's working for your family, I say go for it. But if it comes to a point where the baby's really fussy or agitated and no one's really enjoying themselves at midnight, then maybe it's time to look at it to make a change, you know?
So that actually makes me think of a really important point just from a speech language pathologist point of view. I think sleeping is brought up by a speech therapist in a consultation or therapy in general, because many parents are not aware that lack of sleep can actually have a very negative impact on language development or learning in general. I think the current research points out that overnight, all that new information that babies, toddlers absorb during the day, I actually talked about that in another episode, the process of fast mapping, just taking all that information and using it in a very rapid way. Overnight, that new information gets organized and stored so the baby or toddler can use all that information the next day. So that's what we call brain development.
Right.
Sleep is a huge factor in that.
Right.
So if that process is constantly interrupted, now my baby or my toddler is at risk for possible learning delays. So, I mean, I think even us, like you mentioned, as an adult, if I don't get a good night of sleep, it's really hard for me to focus, concentrate, learn something new the next day. So I think parents are sometimes not aware that there are perhaps long-term risks for not establishing a good sleep pattern, sleep routine.
Yeah. No, that's very true. Like, I always say that sleep training isn't just for the mom. Like, it's for the entire family. Like, I've actually seen with babies where the mom will be, like, texting me so excited. And she'll be like, oh, my God, she just rolled over. Like, this was her first time. Like, I think she finally had the energy to actually do it.
Oh, wow.
I've had that happen so many times. Or, like, where other milestones start. Like you said, word development. And, yeah, I mean, your body needs sleep to rest and restore. Right? That's exactly what sleep is for, to restore. So
right. Not to mention temper. I know my temper is way off if...
and you're an adult, right?
Right.
Imagine a baby who can't regulate their emotions. I mean, they're going to be so much more temperamental when they're exhausted.
So you mentioned soothers. What is your opinion on these external soothers, like using the pacifier for bedtime, bottles, nursing the baby before bed? How is that approached by a pediatric sleep consultant?
Yeah. So I think to start with a pacifier, I think a pacifier is totally fine, but the baby should be able to replace it on their own. Because what happens is if the baby falls asleep with the pacifier and then wakes up and feels like they need it to fall back to sleep, if they can put it in their mouth themselves, it's fine. But if the parent is running in and out of the room, once again, if that works for you, that's fine. But if it doesn't and they're running in and out of the room and playing passy pong, that's what you're going to be doing all night, right? You're going to be replacing it. The baby's going to spit it out and cry. And then that's just going to be what happens. So that's how I feel about the pacifier. In regards to bottle to sleep, so that's the same thing. A lot of parents will say, you know, they give their baby a bottle to sleep, and I did it too. I didn't know, right? But what happens is in the middle of the night, if the baby's learning how to fall asleep on the bottle at bedtime, then they don't know how to put themselves back to sleep in the middle of the night. So they might be waking up 2-3 times a night looking for a bottle because they don't know any other way to soothe themselves. It might not really be that they're hungry. And it's the same thing with nursing. And I think with nursing, sometimes that can be even harder to get away from because nursing is so comforting for the baby, right? So I think all of those things, like what I'll tell parents to do is instead of feeding right before bedtime is making feeding at the beginning of the bedtime routine. That way you keep the baby awake during the feeding and then you proceed with the routine after the feeding and then you put them to sleep awake.
That makes total sense. So, during my career, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of different families and they always share how they put their babies to sleep, and some of them have really interesting rituals.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote a few of them down.
Okay,
so
I'm interested to hear this.
You might be outraged, but I really want your response.
Yeah.
So obviously you mentioned the rocking. I heard a variety of ways of rocking the baby to bed. Sometimes the baby is like really heavy at that point, and Parents
Yeah.
complain that it's really hard to rock them to bed, but it's a very common one. I had a few families that use driving around the block to get their baby to sleep. I had one family that had to replace their car and they went electric because gas prices were really high at that point, and that's what they needed to do to get the twins to sleep.
Wow.
I vividly remember that. Another thing I wrote down was running the dryer or the vacuum. And I wrote some of the painful ones that I encountered. Pulling mom's hair, sometimes to the point where there's bald spots.
Oh, wow.
Pinching skin. And some of the weird ones, sucking on the parent's shoulder or cheek. And I always think to myself, wow, why do parents commit to these ridiculous and most of the time so uncomfortable methods just so they can get their baby to sleep?
I've heard some of these things too, and I think that when you are so exhausted and running on empty because you were just taking care of your baby all day and then you're not sleeping at night and no one's sleeping, I think you're at the point where you are willing to do absolutely anything that it takes just to get 3 hours of sleep. So that's how I see it. I think that, these ways that you have like these examples where parents are trying to get their kids to sleep, so I think they're wrong. If it works for your family, I don't think it's wrong, but I think if you're at the point where you're buying a new vehicle
or you're bruised
or bald, I think it's really important for people to see that there's another way.
That's when you should probably call in for a sleeping consultant, because you have tried all the ways you think are right and none of that works.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to dive into sort of a controversial topic.
Okay.
The topic of co-sleeping.
Okay.
I feel like that I've worked with many families, and I sort of picked up that for some families, there's actually a cultural significance to co-sleeping. It's somewhat very acceptable. Maybe here in the US, it's a little less common or acceptable, not so much encouraged. What are the risks or advantages to co-sleep?
Yeah, so the American Academy of Pediatrics, they strongly advise against co-sleeping because of the risks of SIDS. So in my programs, I do not endorse co-sleeping. And I do heavily understand that it is very cultural. And I think that the reason people do it is A, because it's cultural sometimes, or B, because they feel like it's the only way to get their baby and themselves some sleep. But from my perspective, it's really not shown to be safe, and it's not something that I endorse.
I want to actually define what co-sleeping is, because sometimes when they say co-sleep, it means the baby sleeps in a crib next to them, but not in the same bed. So maybe I should have asked that question first. What is considered co-sleeping?
Got it. So co-sleeping is when you and your baby are sleeping in the same space. So you have a queen size bed and you and your baby are both in that same queen size bed. What I call room sharing is when you have your baby's bassinet or their crib in your room with you, but you each have your own safe sleep space. And that actually, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they recommend that for the first 6 to 12 months, room sharing, not co-sleeping. Okay. So I hope that gives some clarification.
Good thing we clarified that.
Yes.
And are there any risks for continuing room sharing after that time period?
Safety risks, no. But I think that at some point, if you want your child to have independent sleep skills, you're going to want to get them and teach them how to sleep in their own room, in their bed or their crib, in their own space.
Right. And sometimes that's possible, and sometimes just for logistic reasons, it's not.
And that's okay. I've worked with so many families who room share. Because especially the younger babies, like that's what's recommended, right? So we have to go what's recommended, and we've had a lot of success with that.
Great.
So I think that works well.
What do you think about all those sleep sacks and swaddlers? How do they fit into the sleep routine?
Yeah. So a swaddle is great for newborns, but once they are showing signs of rolling or have rolled, you have to get them out because it's unsafe. Right?
Okay.
And then there's transitional sleep sacks that a lot of people will get. So once their baby is rolling in the swaddle and you have to move them, but they're not quite rolling on their bellies to be able to soothe, the transitional sleep sacks are great because they still help prevent that startle reflex that some babies still have that wake them up. And then once they're out of that phase, they can go to the sleep sack, which I think is great. I don't really endorse any particular brands. I think once you have a good sleeper, it doesn't matter. But the American Academy of Pediatrics, they advise against weighted sleep sacks. So that's something to keep in mind.
Unfortunately, whenever we talk about development, and especially between birth to 3, nowadays, the topic of screen time is always part of the conversation. What is your opinion on screen time before bed or getting a baby to sleep in front of a screen? How should we utilize screen time if we're talking about sleeping?
So I am not a parent who's against screen time at all, but I do think there's a time and a place for it, and bedtime is not the time. So I always advise my clients and my own family, we turn the TV off 30 to 60 minutes prior to bedtime. And then at that point, I try to stay off my phone too, because I think when kids see you on your phone, they know you're not paying attention to them. So they're not getting that attention that they feel like they need before bedtime. So then things can get more chaotic, right, than they actually have to be. So I would advise turning all screens off 30 to 60 minutes.
Right, because from what I know, screen time is stimulating in a way. And then you're fighting that once you want to put your baby to sleep.
Yeah, I mean, the research shows that screens, phones, everything, it is very stimulating, and it doesn't help, condone, or what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't perpetuate sleep. It doesn't help with sleep. So I advise against it before bed.
Right. And I think even, I don't know about kids, but there's a lot of research for adults that extensive exposure to screen time before bed contributes to sleeping disturbance, and our quality of sleep is compromised. So I can't imagine.
Right. I mean, I see that all the time in my nurse practitioner job, right? I see patients with insomnia, like adults with insomnia, and a huge reason for that is screen time, because I always say screens, they don't relax you, they distract you. So the second you put that phone down or you turn that TV off, you're still back in your own thoughts. You didn't give yourself that time to really relax.
So let's talk practicality.
Yeah.
If our listeners who already sacrificed about 30 minutes of their awake time to gather some information about sleeping habits, what would be some of the strategies we can recommend or for them to take away from this episode and use to encourage healthier sleeping habits for their kids?
Yeah. I think the first thing is really going to be to figure out the boundary around sleep that works for your family, right? So that's that. Do you want your child to sleep completely independently in their crib? Like, what is going to work for you? And then coming up with a way to make that happen. So one, having a really solid bedtime routine, no matter what, I think is going to be really important, which I know I had mentioned already. And then two, if you do want to sleep train and teach them those independent sleep skills, picking a method that works best for you and implementing it for at least 2 weeks, and understand that babies and kids in general, they're not robots. So they're going to have setbacks, they're going to have regressions, but it's really just figuring out what works best for your family and then making it work within, what you have.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right. No, that makes total sense, because anytime we want to change any kind of habit, it doesn't happen overnight. It certainly requires practice. And I remember with my own son, at some point we picked a method. We had a really good run of him sleeping overnight for a couple of months. And then suddenly he stopped sleeping for no apparent reason. And I think that's what you're referring to as a sleep regression.
Right.
So what are those, and when should we expect them? How should we respond to them?
Yeah. So regressions happen a lot, right? So there's the big one, the 4-month sleep regression. So that's the big one everybody talks about. And that's when your baby's sleep cycles change from being like a newborn to being like an adult and having more adult-like sleep cycles. So that's when babies don't know how to put themselves to sleep and back to sleep in the middle of the night. So that regression, you're just sleep training them. Then there's one at 8 months and 12 months. And a lot of times that can be from just developmental milestones and separation anxiety. And 18 months as well. So my recommendation is going to be to just consistently apply your method and continue with that, because this is when I see things kind of fly off the rails or fall off the rails, because you start giving in a little bit more, and then before you know it, everyone's up again all night.
Right.
So as long as you know your baby's safe and healthy, if your baby's sick, that's obviously a completely different story. But then you're going to want to go back to doing what you originally did in the first place, like going back to the basics.
And how long do these sleep regressions last? How would I differentiate that it's a sleep regression versus my baby just does not know how to self-soothe and go back to sleep?
Yeah, so the 4-month regression is really just that change, right, in cycle. So if you don't make a change, things might get a little bit better, but they're not going to go back to where they were, most likely. But usually regressions can last like a week, up to 2 weeks, most of the time less than that. But as long as you go back to what you want to do to get them to stay asleep, it's going to get better.
And as a parent, I should just expect that during that time, I'm probably not going to sleep as much. Other family members might suffer from that. But from your recommendation is just stick to the routine, and it should sort itself out.
Yes.
Right.
Keep it going. And then sometimes too, like as babies get older and turn into toddlers, they might not need as much sleep, right? So you want to start evaluating how much sleep they're getting, how much do they need for their age, because that can also cause wake ups in the middle of the night and issues with naps. So that's something to watch as well. And I see that as kids get to like the 2-year and 3-year age group, they need less sleep. So when they're taking those monster 2-3 hour naps, it's affecting their nighttime sleep because they're not as tired.
Right. And sometimes the parent would have to initiate reducing those naps.
Exactly.
To get better night's sleep.
Exactly.
Right. So around what age does that happen? Because I remember my kids stopped napping very early on, before the age of 2. And I didn't try to fight it. I just said, okay, it is what it is. And I'm just going to have a very long day with them. Or early. But I think for some parents, it's really hard to accept, or they try to fight the fact that the child doesn't need that as much napping.
Typically, kids drop their nap around 3. Some before, some after, but usually 3. And I usually say, like, if you have an 18-month-old that's giving you trouble with nap, it could A, be a regression and you just have to power through it, or B, they need to have their schedule changed a little bit, have less daytime sleep, figure out like their total sleep needs. But I really do see 2 as that age where people think that their kid doesn't need a nap anymore, when it's really just that regression and just needing a little bit of tweaking with their schedule, usually. And every kid is different, right? All babies and toddlers are different, so that's something to look out for as well.
If a family has questions about everything that we talked about today, how would they be able to reach out to you and look more carefully into that?
So I love getting questions. Instagram is a big one for me. So my Instagram handle is Brittany, BRITTANY _sleep consultant. And I also have a website, which is goodnightnursebh.com. So you can schedule a discovery call there. You can DM me on Instagram.
That's great. Yeah. Any email address? Or
yes, I have an email address too. It's Brittany Heffitz at goodnightnursebh.com.
Amazing. Yeah. And for anyone out there that struggles perhaps with sleeping routine with their kids, you also mentioned there are a lot of online resources, but I think having somebody next to you that really tailors the method to your family dynamics makes a huge difference, right?
I really agree. I mean, I give my clients 2 weeks of tech support, and I found that with consistency, especially like I'm there for them at bedtime to help get them through that initial couple of nights, and it is really everything for a lot of these parents who just want to make sure that they're doing the right thing for their baby, Right. And then I'm also there during the day, like with nap help if they need. I always say too, I think with sleep consultants, people think that they have to be on a very rigid schedule, but that's not necessarily the case. Like, you have to do what works best with your family, and if you're not the kind of family that wants to be on a rigid schedule, that's okay too. Like, I can work with that. It's really just getting your family on track for what works best for you.
And who doesn't dream of a good night's sleep?
Oh man, let me tell you, my life was changed once we were sleeping better.
Right. And then you think to yourself, why did I wait that long? Why did I put myself through all of that?
I know.
And we do that, especially as moms. I mean, I could only speak as a mom, but we compromise so much of our comfort for the sake of the kids.
And I think that we think we're supposed to.
Right.
Right. But I think that one of my biggest goals is to change that narrative, because everything should be about the family, right? Not just about one person in that family. So you want to do what's going to be best for everybody.
Wow. To me, that's the takeaway,
yeah.
Here. So Brittany, it has been a pleasure getting all this really important, useful information that really is going to help not only sleep, but any kind of learning, any kind of habit change. So I really appreciate you giving your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
If you found this information to be useful and you think you know somebody that might benefit from this kind of information, then please do subscribe or click on the follow button so that more people get the opportunity to learn something that could help their family. So that's all for today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you all next time.